Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into the candlelit corridors of Europe's royal courts, places draped in velvet, dripping with gold and echoing with the weight of titles. But behind the portraits and pearls lies something quieter, something stitched into the bloodlines of princesses you've probably seen painted with halos of blonde hair and porcelain skin. You're about to meet them, and I promise you probably won't survive this bloodline. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from a castle or a cottage or just curled up under blankets somewhere, post your location and your local time in the comments. I'd love to know. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a royal nursery. The windows are tall, but the air's oddly still. A child, maybe 5, curls up under an embroidered canopy, pale and doll-like. Her name? You've heard it before: Maria Theresa, Isabella, Catherine, take your pick. These girls are everywhere in history books, but tonight you're noticing something different, something fragile, a stiffness in the limbs, a jaw set a little too tightly, a skin tone that whispers don't touch. It's the look of someone bred not for survival, but for symbolism. Because royal daughters were never meant to just live. They were designed, a product of centuries of inbreeding meant to preserve bloodlines, not bodies. Their ancestors didn't think in chromosomes, they thought in coats of arms. You try to follow her bloodline. It loops and doubles back like some twisted embroidery. Her grandfather is also her great-uncle. Her mother's sister is her step-grandmother. You get dizzy tracing it, like watching someone use a family tree as a lasso. And here she is, the outcome of all those noble intentions, blinking up at you from a velvet pillow. To be born a royal daughter in 16th or 17th century Europe is to be born into a paradox. You are both everything and nothing. Everyone wants to marry you, but no one wants you to talk too much. You wear dresses that weigh more than a modern suitcase, but you're expected to walk like mist on a lake. You are adored, but not loved. Your tutors teach you languages you're not allowed to speak in court. You read books you're meant to forget. You are praised for your purity, not of heart, but of blood. That last one's key, because these girls are carrying centuries of genetic pressure. Their faces are portraits of family loyalty, and their bodies are where the cracks start to show. Take a deep breath. Smell that faint aroma. It's beeswax and rosewater, with a whisper of something sharper. Medicine cabinet sharp. Court physicians are already hovering around her, muttering about humors and miasmas. They'll probably suggest bleeding her before lunch. Meanwhile, she coughs. She coughs a lot. That's normal here. Royal daughters don't bounce back the way peasant girls do. Their immune systems are a little confused, their spines sometimes curve like soft wax, and their teeth, if they erupt at all, might do so at odd angles. You'd think with all this luxury they'd be invincible, but that's the illusion. The gowns and diamonds are just decorative armor. Remember, this is not about one little girl, it's a pattern. From the Spanish Habsburgs to the Austrian Empire, generations of royal daughters were born with conditions so normalized within their families, they were called traits instead of warning signs. That famous Habsburg chin, it wasn't just a funny-looking jaw. It was a visible red flag for a family line imploding on itself. Historians still argue whether the royal obsession with pure bloodlines was ever about health at all. Some claim it was always political, a way to keep power in tight circles. Others insist they truly believed it was cleaner, safer, divine. Either way, the consequences sat heavy on the smallest shoulders. Back in the nursery, the girl tries to rise. Her governess swoops in. No, sweet one, not yet. She's 5 and she's already being protected from herself. She's had too many dizzy spells and her bones are a bit too soft. She's not alone. By the time she turns 7, 1 or 2 of her sisters may already have died of the fever, or a chill, or something no one bothers to name. And yet, despite all this, she's still a prize. The court painters know exactly how to pose her. Neck long, eyes downcast, fingers like pale ribbons. She's not just a child, she's a political promise. You realize, looking at her portrait, that her body has never belonged to her. It belongs to the empire. One fringe theory floating around some dusty corners of academia: that certain courts intentionally looked for signs of genetic fragility as proof of royal blood. Think about it. If you were too robust, too loud, too opinionated, were you truly noble, or were you suspiciously healthy? It sounds absurd now, but back then, a sickly princess was seen as delicate, divine, and perfectly moldable. It made her less likely to rebel, less likely to run, less likely to say no when she was told she'd be married off to her cousin in some cold, distant palace. Which brings you to one final image tonight before we drift to the next chamber. A mother, royal, regal, watching her daughter being dressed for a portrait. Her hands are still, but her eyes not so much. Maybe she sees what you see, that the girl before her is breaking under the weight of centuries, but she doesn't say it. She adjusts the hem of the gown. She nods to the painter, and the record is made. Not of illness, not of fear, but of perfection. You're still in the palace, but now your footsteps echo through the archives. Gold-lined scrolls, leather-bound tomes, family trees taller than you are unfurling like ancient tapestries. But when you squint at the lines, those carefully inked marriages and births, you notice something strange. They don't branch outward, they loop, spiral, collapse in on themselves. What you're holding isn't a tree. It's a circle drawn over and over again, like someone trying to trap bloodlines in a cage of repetition. You can almost hear the echoes of royal advisors whispering, "Keep the crown in the family, keep the throne pure." And with each decision, the branches grow smaller, narrower, weaker. You're now tracing the genealogy of one of the great dynasties. Let's say the Habsburgs, because their family web is the genetic equivalent of a Rubik's Cube someone gave up on. You blink and realize that Charles II of Spain, the one whose tongue was too large to speak clearly and whose lower jaw wouldn't close, had fewer distinct ancestors than your average goat. Literally. By the time he was born, his family tree contained more cousin marriages than a rural matchmaking fair in Fast Forward. But he's a king, and kings need wives. So what do the royal advisors do? Look around for another cousin, of course. That's how it worked for centuries. Across Europe, from Vienna to Versailles, Madrid to Moscow, marriages weren't arranged across distant kingdoms as often as you'd think. They were usually arranged across hallways, sometimes even upstairs. You've got siblings marrying siblings' children, nieces marrying uncles, granddaughters marrying grandsons of their own great aunts. If you're dizzy, imagine how their chromosomes felt. Historians still argue whether the full extent of the inbreeding was understood or just willfully ignored. Some say the nobility truly believed blue blood ran better when undiluted. Others think they knew exactly what they were risking and just gambled with their daughters' lives anyway. After all, it's not like they had to personally bear the children. You run your finger along a family chart of the Austrian royal house. There's Joanna of Castile, Juana la Loca, married to Philip the Handsome, her Habsburg cousin. Their children, a cocktail of mental instability and bone disorders. The trend continued so precisely that by the time Charles II was born, his inbreeding coefficient was higher than the theoretical offspring of a brother-sister union. Chew on that before bed. And here's the kicker. Most royal daughters weren't asked how they felt about any of this. At most, they were told to smile during portraits and not vomit in front of foreign ambassadors. You might think that if anyone could object to marrying their uncle, it'd be a princess. But no, that was the job, being pretty, pliant, and genetically compatible with whoever had the right crest over their bedchamber door. Still, not everyone was thrilled about it. Occasionally, a confessor or private tutor would scribble a note in the margins of a diary. The child trembled at the thought of her husband's age. You pause, noticing that said husband is 48. She is 13. Charming. These family webs weren't just messy, they were dangerous. And not just for health. Think politically. When everyone is married to everyone, and your aunt is also your sister-in-law and second cousin, It's not just the gene pool that gets murky, it's the alliances. You start to lose track of who's loyal to whom. Wars have literally broken out over this confusion. Remember Isabella II of Spain. When her father died, a major succession crisis erupted because so many relatives had overlapping claims. The irony: half of them shared more DNA with her than most twins. One prince even campaigned for the throne while married to her sister. Thanksgiving must have been awkward. And don't forget the fringe theory that royal bloodlines were intentionally designed to be confusing, to make outside claims nearly impossible. After all, if everyone's related, who can say for sure whose child has the truer right to rule? It's both a trap and a defense mechanism. Genius in its madness. Take a breath. You're in a side chamber now. Tapestries dim the candlelight. A painting catches your eye, a princess, maybe 12, in stiff brocade. She looks directly at you blankly. Her hands are folded just so, and her jaw juts forward, unmistakably Habsburg. You can't tell if it's the painter's style or if she's truly struggling to close her mouth. Her name was Margarita Teresa, betrothed at 3, dead at 21, likely from complications of childbirth. Her husband, her uncle, yet. As you trace her story, you notice something eerie. Across Europe, across dynasties, the same shapes keep reappearing. Ovals for faces, pale blue eyes, overly long noses, high foreheads, and that persistent underbite. The daughters are matching not just in style, but in structure. By now, you know what that means. And yet, the system kept spinning. Because in the royal mind, the danger wasn't too much inbreeding. It was not enough. Marrying outside the noble pool was unthinkable. That's how you got revolts, or worse, healthy children who looked suspiciously normal. So the strategy remained: marry within, breed carefully, cross family lines like you're folding origami, and when a daughter dies young, try again. There's always another niece. And that's where you leave tonight's thread. Not with a dramatic scream or coronation, just the quiet unfolding of another branch that loops into itself. A spiral of good intentions and terrible consequences. You step back from the chart. There are no straight lines here. Only circles. You're now seated in a throne room, though not the kind where power is exercised. It's more like a showroom for royal genetics. Portraits line the walls like museum specimens, and everyone seems to be staring at the lower half of your face. Why? Because tonight, it's all about the jaw. The most famous jaw in European history, in fact, the Habsburg jaw. Imagine being so genetically distinct that your chin gets its own Wikipedia section. Now imagine passing that chin down like it's an heirloom teacup, except this teacup grows larger with each generation, and eventually starts interfering with speech, eating, and, well, life. You're meeting the daughters now, the ones who inherited that chin without choice or ceremony. You watch them in side profile, long faces, thick lips, jutting mandibles. Not caricatures, not monsters, just teenagers trying to sip soup in a court where beauty is everything. Welcome to the case of the Austrian jaw. You reach back a bit into the 1500s, when this distinctive facial structure began to harden into a family signature. Earlier Habsburgs had the beginnings of it, but by the time the 17th century rolled around, it was unmistakable. Archduchesses were painted in stiff, stately poses, eyes half-lidded, lips slightly parted, not in sensuality but necessity. Their jaws didn't close properly. Historians still debate how much the Habsburg jaw influenced European politics. Did rival kings secretly mock it? Did marriage proposals quietly dissolve because of it? Fringe theorists love this stuff, spinning tales about spurned betrothals and French insults so scandalous they were burned from the archives. What's confirmed is this: it became a punchline in private letters. Even courtiers whispered about the chin that conquered Castile. But for the royal daughters bearing it, it wasn't funny. You run your fingers across an old sketch of Maria Ana of Spain. In life, she was known for her piety, but in portraits, you can't help but notice her elongated face and protruding lower lip. Contemporary accounts describe her as gentle and much afflicted by the teeth. That's 17th century code for her jaw hurt constantly, and chewing was a small war. It wasn't just a cosmetic problem. The Habsburg jaw often came with malocclusion, a misalignment of the teeth and jaws, which caused constant discomfort, speech impediments, and difficulty eating. And when you're a princess who's expected to perform elegance at every waking moment, lisping through a banquet or wincing while chewing isn't ideal. Court physicians tried everything: diets of soft food, herbal pastes rubbed on the jawline, mechanical braces that looked more like torture devices than dental care. Nothing worked, because the problem wasn't in the habits, it was in the blueprints. You're handed a genealogy chart again. By now, you can predict what it'll show: cousin marriage, uncle marriage, the occasional aunt loop. It's like watching someone try to bake a cake by mixing the same batter over and over. No wonder it all collapsed into flour dust. One fringe belief from the time: that the jaw was a sign of royal strength. Some priests even argued it was proof of divine selection. After all, who else could survive with such a face and still be considered noble? That's one way to spin it. You step into a quieter room now, this one filled with busts, literal busts, carved from marble, all displaying noblewomen in full regalia. But again, the chin dominates. You wonder if the sculptors toned it down, or maybe they enhanced it like a badge of genetic pride. Either way, these weren't just likenesses, they were warnings. In walks a young princess, maybe 15. You can picture her alive, her jaw already aching in the mornings. Her tutors focus on posture, languages, embroidery. No one mentions the pain. She's told she's beautiful, then told she'll be married next year. To whom? To her cousin Maximilian, of course. You nod grimly. Of course. She smiles, a tight smile. You realize it's the only kind she can make. Fast forward a few years and her condition has worsened. Chewing takes effort. Her face has grown more severe, but no one dares suggest she's less beautiful. She is royal and therefore perfect, even when the reality says otherwise. And here's something eerie. Scientists in the 20th century actually studied the Habsburg jaw, decades after the monarchy collapsed. They concluded it was a textbook case of mandibular prognathism caused by centuries of inbreeding. According to the studies, the more inbred the royal, the more severe the jaw deformity. The data doesn't lie. You stare at a graph that's basically a map of bad decisions. Historians still argue whether the royal families were aware of this correlation. Some claim they simply chalked it up to God's will. Others believe they were too concerned with politics to care. After all, what's a little jaw pain when you're uniting empires? But for the daughters, it wasn't an abstract concept. It was daily discomfort, social embarrassment, the knowledge that you were, quite literally, the face of dynastic decay. And yet they endured it with grace. You walk past portraits of princesses who smiled through the ache, curtsied through the pain, and signed marriage contracts with jaws that barely moved. Their names are mostly forgotten, their chins eternal. As you step out of the gallery, you hear a whisper from the past, a courtier's voice perhaps. A noble chin, sharp enough to cut treaties. You almost laugh, almost. But then you remember the girl with the soup spoon, and suddenly it doesn't feel so funny anymore. You step now into the quietest room in the palace, the nursery. Not the cheerful kind with stuffed toys and lullabies, but a vaulted, drafty chamber where sunlight filters in reluctantly and everything smells faintly of lavender, chalk, and decay. Here, royal daughters begin their lives under silken canopies, watched over by wet nurses and courtiers who count every breath. You watch a nurse lean over a crib. Her face is careful, polite, but you can tell she's worried. The baby's color is off, a little too pale, her cry is thin. There's a tremor in her tiny fingers. Maybe it's just the cold, maybe it's something worse. Either way, no one says it out loud. Because in this world, sickly children aren't a surprise, they're expected. You begin to notice the pattern. Across Europe's courts, from Versailles to Vienna, infant mortality was not only common, it was institutionalized. Royal nurseries had more funerals than birthdays. The children who survived often did so narrowly. Many of the daughters grew up with frail frames, persistent fevers, and nervous systems as delicate as spun sugar. Some palaces even had special baby coffins ready to go, decorated in gold, trimmed with lace, like a grim form of optimism. Historians still argue whether these frailties were due solely to inbreeding or worsened by the obsessive court practices around childbirth. Royal mothers were often forbidden to move much during pregnancy. They were bled, fed strange concoctions, told not to look at ugly things lest the baby inherit them. Superstition sat right next to science, and guess who got the worst of it? You peek into a case containing baby gowns stitched for Princess Marie Anne Victoire of Spain. She lived for less than 3 months. Her portrait shows her posthumously, painted from memory, rosy cheeks added later by the artist to make her look livelier. She died of a wasting sickness. Translation: no one really knew, or they did, but didn't dare put it in ink. You learn that many royal daughters were swaddled so tightly that their ribs failed to expand properly. They were fed wet nurse milk that sometimes carried infection. And worst of all, they were born from mothers who were themselves already too inbred to deliver healthy offspring. Generations of weak pelvises, narrow hips, and recurring stillbirths told their own kind of history. You pause by a cradle. Inside it, nothing moves. But on the wall behind it, names are stitched into a velvet panel. Isabella, Maria, Anna, Catherine, Dorothea, all gone before their 5th birthdays. You feel like you're standing in the middle of a genetic war zone where the casualties were bundled in lace. One fringe theory from the 18th century posited that royal blood was simply too noble for the rigors of ordinary life. They needed special care, special air, even special pillows. You can almost picture the royal physician puffing up with pride, as if fragile infants were proof of celestial favor. Never mind the funerals. But among all these stories, one stands out: Margaret Theresa of Austria. You remember her from that Velázquez painting, tiny, pale, golden-haired. She looks like a doll, but her life was one long illness. Constipation, seizures, miscarriages, and exhaustion followed her like shadows. She was married to her uncle and had one surviving daughter before dying at just 21. Her letters, what few remain, mention frequent fainting and how the pain in her bones travels more each day. Doctors called it melancholia. We call it a hereditary condition. You take a step back from the crib. This wasn't just bad luck. It was a pattern of systemic neglect and dangerous tradition. By marrying so tightly within their own lines, these royal families were shrinking not just their family trees, but their gene pools. And the daughters felt it first. Historians note that male heirs were more likely to be named, recorded, remembered. But the daughters bore a different kind of burden. They were expected to be perfect while being physically compromised. They had to survive long enough to be married off, but not so long they caused political inconvenience. It's a high-wire act on brittle bones. You catch a whisper, one nurse speaking to another. She didn't cry much. Maybe she wasn't meant to. You look down at a small pair of shoes, never worn, ivory silk, too perfect for a foot that never grew large enough to fill them. That's the kind of memento this palace holds. Not just grandeur, but ghosts. You reach a stained glass window depicting a royal baptism. Everyone's glowing with divine approval, but you know what happened after: the illness, the slow, wasting decline, the coughs no physician could stop, the blood that wouldn't clot, and finally the discreet note in a court ledger. The Infanta has passed. The Queen will not receive guests this week. That's all they got, a single line. But in these halls, the silence says more. You step outside now, not into the sunlight, but into a courtyard soaked in ceremony. Trumpets, gilded carriages, pages scrambling with embroidered cushions. It looks like a celebration, but everyone's eyes are on one person. A girl no more than 12, wrapped in brocade and gold-threaded silk, her hands trembling slightly beneath her gloves. She's being presented, not as a daughter, not even as a girl, but as a treaty stitched into skin. You're watching the breeding of brides. Here, in this theater of royal pomp, daughters aren't raised for affection. They're cultivated like prized orchids in the hothouse of statecraft. Every curtsy is a chess move. Every lesson in dancing or Latin or the Psalms is really preparation for the moment they'll be traded like playing cards across Europe's courts. You're now following a real example, Anne of Austria. She's a teenager when she's married off to Louis XIII of France. Sounds romantic, right? Except she's never met him, doesn't speak his language, and is already 2 years younger than the age she's pretending to be. Her trousseau alone fills 20 carts, but not one of them carries consent. Historians still argue whether these diplomatic marriages ever really benefited the girls themselves. Some say they were empowered queens in training. Others argue they were just political glue, applied, then forgotten. Either way, their bodies were the battlegrounds. And here's the uncomfortable bit. They were often bred for this, quite literally. Royal daughters were conceived with alliances in mind. A boy secures the throne. A girl, she's currency. And the prettier and paler she is, the higher her dowry climbs. Take Maria Leopoldine of Austria, married off at 16 to the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand III, who was twice her age. She bore him a son within a year, died shortly after. The family mourned, briefly, then turned their eyes to her younger sister. You start to notice how young they all were. You hear whispers behind fans, "She bleeds now." That's all it took. Monarchy marked the start of usefulness. If a girl menstruated, she could be married. If she could be married, she could be sent. Doesn't matter if she still sleeps with dolls. You trail behind one such bride on her journey. Let's call her Elizabeth Farnese, soon to be Queen of Spain. She's shipped off like a porcelain export, dressed in Italian lace that will be picked over by Spanish courtiers for signs of modesty and favor. She's expected to charm a court she doesn't know, bear children for a man she's never met, and make 0 political mistakes for the rest of her life. And people complain about job interviews. Some royal daughters had to undergo public marriage by proxy ceremonies. Imagine standing before a crowd while some stranger, often a bald old duke, places a ring on your finger to symbolize your new husband, who isn't even there. It's like speed dating meets ghost marriage. You watch as another girl, a Habsburg this time, is paraded through city gates. The people cheer. She's terrified. She's 16 and has just left behind everyone she knew to enter a foreign palace with unfamiliar rules and colder sheets. But she smiles, because that's what she was trained to do, that and produce an heir. One fringe theory: that courts chose sicklier girls for certain matches, banking on short marriages to reset alliances without long-term entanglements. Disposable queens, essentially. Historians roll their eyes, but the pattern raises questions. And if you're wondering, what if the girl said no? Well, that was considered a mental breakdown. There are records of royal daughters collapsing during betrothal ceremonies, fainting during blessings, even vomiting during wedding feasts. No one cared. They were still escorted down the aisle, tears wiped, corsets tightened. You peek into a private chamber post-wedding. A young bride is being undressed by unfamiliar maids. Her new family's crest hangs over the bed. Her own name has already been rewritten in letters of Latin and state. She's now the Queen, or Her Royal Highness, but no longer Maria or Teresa or Anne. She is function. She is form. She is contract. Historians love to debate whether these girls found small freedoms. Maybe some did. Maybe they wielded influence through whisper campaigns or secret patronage. But here, in the fresh hush of post-marriage silence, you don't hear freedom. You hear fatigue, and the muffled sob of someone pretending it's just homesickness. And remember, these weren't rare cases. This was the system. Royal daughters across Europe were raised for export, trained to suppress fear, desire, and even memory. Because nothing derails a marriage alliance like a bride who remembers her old language too fondly. Before you leave this courtyard of veils and vows, you pass a trunk. Inside it, letters home, carefully folded, most never sent. Some are written in multiple languages, as if the girl wasn't sure who she was supposed to be anymore. One ends with a simple line, "Tell my little sister to be stronger than I was." And then the ink runs out. You step into a quiet chamber now, its walls padded with tapestry and its floor thick with Persian rugs. A fire crackles, but the warmth feels performative. A woman lies in bed, too still. Her name is Maria Amelia, or maybe it's Louise Elizabeth. Honestly, it could be any of a dozen royal daughters. The name changes, the story doesn't. You've entered the world of wombs, those royal body parts more scrutinized than any diplomatic treaty. Because once a daughter was married off, her next function was even more urgent: produce heirs, and not just one, preferably a dozen, male if possible, and if she dies doing it, well, the midwives were prepared for that too. You hear the quiet rustle of midwives in the next room. Candles flicker, the physician is late, the princess is bleeding. It happens more often than the portraits admit. Royal daughters, once they became wives, entered a second, more dangerous chamber of dynastic service. Their wombs became arenas of political pressure. Their cycles were tracked like battle schedules. A missed period could cause diplomatic tremors, a miscarriage, potential scandal, and a daughterless womb, practically a public failure. Take Empress Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, married to Charles VI. She had 4 children, only one survived. The pressure to birth more heirs, immense. She was constantly under surveillance, politely of course. The court called it tending to Her Majesty's health. Translation: checking whether she looked pregnant yet. Historians still argue whether royal mothers had any say over their reproductive lives. There's little evidence of effective birth control. What existed, crocodile dung pastes, crushed emerald pills, magical amulets, was more folklore than science. And most royal daughters weren't even allowed to consider such options. Childbirth wasn't optional, it was duty. You follow one woman through her calendar. Married at 15, first pregnancy by 16, miscarried twins, second child stillborn, third finally a boy, cheered through the palace. By 19, she's pregnant again. This time she doesn't survive. The baby dies a week later. The court sends condolences. Her husband immediately begins discussions for a new match. You pause because that wasn't a dramatic outlier. That was standard procedure. There's a fringe belief among modern theorists that European monarchies treated women as renewable vessels. The goal wasn't a single perfect queen, but a rotating supply of viable ones. A little dark, maybe, but look at the numbers. The average life expectancy of a royal bride post-marriage plummeted. Many didn't reach 30, some didn't reach 20. And yet they kept coming. Daughters trained from childhood to see pregnancy not as life, but obligation. Girls who played with dolls knowing their own children might never make it out of the nursery. And even if they did, those daughters would be placed on the same conveyor belt. You find yourself in a royal birthing chamber now. No sterile white walls here, just silk, gilt mirrors, crosses on every shelf, a priest in the corner murmuring prayers, sometimes before the baby is even born, because stillbirth was expected. Midwives were trained to baptize dying infants within seconds, just in case. One story stops you cold. Joanna of Austria, Princess of Portugal. She was only a teenager when her father arranged a match with her cousin. She begged to be allowed to remain unmarried and live a religious life. For a time, she got her wish. But even in a convent, her status as royal daughter made her a political pawn. Papal letters reveal intense debate over whether she could be borrowed for a dynastic marriage. Borrowed, like a sacred vase. And if you're wondering where the fathers were in all this, usually in the council chamber, or hunting, sometimes praying, rarely at the bedside. The suffering belonged to the women, the legacy to the men. You notice a pattern in the birthing records. Many royal daughters died on their 3rd or 4th pregnancy. The strain simply broke them. Others were quietly removed from court life after repeated stillbirths. sent to the country for her nerves. You know what that means. And yet, among the scrolls and whispers, you catch moments of real resistance. One duchess fakes an illness to avoid further pregnancies. Another secretly funds a midwife's escape after a dangerous labor. One bold princess refuses to consummate her marriage for months. Of course, they eventually gave in. They had to, but those small rebellions, they linger. Historians call it dynastic pressure. You call it generational trauma. You glance at a court diary. One line stands out. The queen has delivered again. She weeps though the child is strong. Of course she weeps. She knows what comes next. You find yourself at a wedding again, but it's not the candlelit fairy tale you might expect. The air is too thick. The guests, a little too quiet. The bride, she's 17 and has known the groom since she was 6 because he's her uncle. Tonight you witness a trend so normalized in royal Europe, it barely raised eyebrows, when uncles became husbands. There's no polite way around it. The family trees of Europe's ruling dynasties didn't just bend, they folded into themselves like badly kept secrets. Cousins married cousins, sure, but when political needs sharpened, they went further. Uncles married nieces. Aunts were offered to nephews. The result? Generations of royal daughters whose grooms already knew their baby teeth. Take Maria Anna of Austria, married off to her maternal uncle Philip IV of Spain. She was 14. He was 38 and had been married to her aunt. When their first child was born, she was 16 and permanently ill from the delivery. The baby died in infancy. So did the second. Only one child survived, Charles II, the infamous king whose Habsburg jaw was so pronounced he could barely eat without choking. You remember him from earlier. That child was the product of an uncle-niece union, stacked atop generations of cousin marriages. The result? A human genetic crisis. Historians still argue how aware these courts were of the biological risks. Some advisors warned against close kin marriages, citing miscarriages and deformities. Others, usually priests or political strategists, dismissed it as superstition. The line was always the same. God wouldn't allow the union if it were wrong. Comforting if you're not the one giving birth to the outcome. You trail behind another niece bride, Maria Theresa of Spain, married to Louis XIV of France. Their shared ancestry made their children a genetic echo. When their daughter was born with frailty and bowed legs, the court called it delicate health. You call it inbreeding fatigue. The strange part, these marriages weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. Family alliances were stronger if sealed within. No messy new bloodlines, no unpredictability, just a tighter grip on the throne. There's a fringe theory that some monarchs preferred these marriages precisely because they limited external interference. An uncle wouldn't betray his niece-turned wife politically. A cousin bride was less likely to question authority. It wasn't just about blood, it was about control. You step now into a cathedral. It's filled with roses, but something feels off. The altar is dressed in gold. The groom waits in an ermine-lined coat, and the bride walks toward him, face pale, lips tight. She's 13. Her father has placed her hand into her uncle. It's not a mistake, it's a strategy. Later in the bridal chamber, maids adjust her hair while she sits silently. Her new title will be queen or duchess, but what she really is resigned. These aren't just one-off events. You start noticing patterns. In the Bourbon family, the Habsburgs, the Portuguese crown, the Savoy line, over and over royal daughters were asked, expected, to marry men who had once held them as bobbies. In one letter from a Habsburg archduchess to her daughter, the marriage proposal is written casually. You'll be wed to your uncle. He is fond of you and your Latin is improving. You can't make that up. And what did this mean for the children? They were born with compressed genomes, higher rates of developmental disorders, lower survival rates, increased mental illness. The closer the match, the sharper the consequences. But again, no one said it aloud. The system couldn't afford to be questioned. You enter a drawing room where two princesses are playing chess. One is engaged to her cousin. The other is promised to her mother's brother. They both know it. They giggle like it's just another fact of life, because, to them, it is. And here's the most surreal part. The royal courts romanticized these unions. Poems were written, portraits painted, love stories fabricated. The court artists conveniently left out the 10-year age gaps and blood ties, because nothing says legacy like selective memory. One example, Joanna of Austria was betrothed to her uncle at age 7. The union fell through, but the letters exist. One reads, "Her temperament is agreeable and she has the family look. Charming." You finish the scene with a visit to a crypt. Marble tombs line the walls. Names repeat like mantras: Maria, Anna, Isabella, Charles, Philip, over and over. You realize most of the people buried here are related in at least 3 ways to someone buried just one alcove over. You want to map it out, but honestly, you'd need string, pins, and a very dark sense of humor. It leaves you with one quiet question. If power demands this much blood sacrifice, how powerful is it really? You close the crypt door gently, because the silence here, it isn't just respect, it's repetition. The hallway is hushed, lined with thick tapestries and flickering candles. You're following the faint sound of weeping. Not loud sobs, no, this is the quieter kind. The kind that echoes from deep inside a locked room. Inside, behind heavy velvet curtains, lies a princess the world has forgotten. Her name, once whispered in coronation halls, now lives only in diary margins and hushed rumors. She is one of many, the mad queens and silent sisters. You're beginning to understand that for royal daughters, it wasn't just fragile bones and risky births that came with inbreeding. It was mental fragility, too. Delicate minds, brittle under pressure, further strained by genetic repetition. And when those minds buckled, the palace had a solution: hide them. You step into a room with iron-grated windows. There's a gilded harp gathering dust in the corner, and a thick book of psalms lies open on a table. This was once the chamber of Princess Joanna of Castile, known to history, somewhat cruelly, as Juana la Loca. Historians still argue whether she was truly insane or simply too emotional, too outspoken, too unwilling to play the quiet, obedient role assigned to her. What we know, Joanna was intensely devoted to her husband, Philip the Handsome. When he died, she carried his embalmed body with her from city to city, refusing to bury him for months. The court branded her mad, but was it madness or heartbreak mixed with inherited instability, nudged over the edge by isolation and power games? You watch court physicians bustle in and out, armed with leeches and holy water. Their diagnoses are vague: melancholia, hysteria, disquieted humors. Their treatments are worse: cold baths, opium, isolation. But none address the underlying issue, that these daughters are trapped in bodies and bloodlines already rigged against them. Another face appears: Elizabeth of Bavaria, Empress of Austria, known as Sissy. She becomes a cult figure later, but behind the beauty was a woman constantly fleeing. She suffered anorexia, depression, and what we now label severe anxiety. Her diaries are full of longing for freedom, of resentment toward the court's rigid expectations. She would disappear for weeks, riding alone, barely eating, always mourning the daughter she lost and the son who took his own life. Sissy wasn't locked away, but she was just as imprisoned. You turn another corner and find a wing sealed off from the main palace. This is where Catherine of Austria lived out her days, blind, disabled, intellectually impaired, and almost entirely erased from court records. Her siblings wrote about her fondly but rarely. To the world, she was unfortunate. Behind closed doors, she was family and proof of the dangers they wouldn't speak of. Not all the silent sisters were born that way. Some were made, like Princess Alexandrina of Bavaria, who believed she had swallowed a glass piano, not metaphorically, literally. She walked carefully, believing any sudden movement would shatter her insides. Her eccentricities were dismissed as harmless. But you can't help but wonder, how many layers of trauma, pressure, and bloodline fragility went into creating a belief like that? There's a heavy sadness to these halls. You start to notice a pattern. Whenever a royal daughter began speaking too much, crying too often, or simply refusing to smile on cue, she disappeared, shuffled off to a countryside convent, or a restful villa, or a private estate with a staff trained to look the other way. Some had happier fates. Princess Louise of Belgium, for instance, ran off with a cavalry officer. The court declared her insane and locked her away in an asylum for years. Her crime? Choosing passion over protocol. And yet in all these stories you sense resistance. Some silent sisters scribbled poems. Others embroidered secret messages. Some left behind music, drawings, or coded journals. Even in isolation, they reached out. Fringe theories suggest that some of these women weren't mentally ill at all, but highly intelligent, creative minds suffocating in shallow, ritual-bound environments. Thinkers born into dollhouses. Artists locked inside porcelain boxes. Not mad, just miscast. One soft theory posits that generations of inbreeding may have affected not just brain chemistry but neurological wiring, leading to higher incidences of epilepsy, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder in royal women. But again, the records are patchy. The symptoms either overdescribed in fits of drama or erased completely. You run your fingers along the embroidered motto on a faded wall hanging. Silence is grace. It sounds more like a sentence than a virtue. Imagine being born into a life where every twitch is watched, every tear is questioned, and your family's entire legacy rests on your ability to smile politely through it all. And if you can't, if your mind stutters or your nerves fray, you're banished. Still, something lingers in these abandoned rooms. It's not just sorrow, it's strength. Because even when these royal daughters cracked, they didn't shatter. Even when they vanished, they left echoes. Their letters, their locked diaries, their quiet rebellion. You can almost hear them. Not screaming, whispering. You wake up to the sound of clinking crystal. Not wine glasses, but fragile bones. You're in another nursery, though this one doesn't smell of powder and lavender. It smells of something colder, almost sterile, like fear wrapped in silk. Here lies yet another royal daughter, barely more than a shadow beneath the embroidered quilt. Her skin is translucent, veins blue beneath it like rivers traced on parchment. When you touch her wrist, gently, it feels as if it might crumble. This is the world of hemophilia and osteogenesis imperfecta, both devastatingly common among Europe's elite bloodlines. These weren't just unfortunate coincidences. They were the endgame of too many closed circles on too many family trees. You watch a governess dab at the girl's nosebleed. Not unusual, except this one's been going on for 2 hours. That's the thing with hemophilia. It turns minor bruises into life-threatening episodes. Cuts don't clot. Internal bleeding creeps in silently. In many palaces, especially in 19th century Russia and Britain, this was the disease that defined a dynasty. Q. Alexandra, Empress of Russia, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and her son Alexei, the doomed heir with hemophilia. But what's often glossed over is that the gene came through Victoria's daughters. One of the most famous carriers of the mutation, Queen Victoria passed it to several of her children, who married into other royal families and unknowingly spread the disorder like a quiet curse. You glance across the royal map. Spain, Germany, Prussia, Russia, all affected. But while the spotlight often fell on the hemophiliac sons, the silent carriers were the daughters. Women like Princess Alice and Princess Irene passed on the gene with little understanding of the weight they carried in their blood. Their daughters lived under a different kind of pressure, perceived as both vessels of future glory and time bombs of invisible doom. Now shift the lens slightly. Meet the lesser-known cousin of hemophilia, osteogenesis imperfecta, sometimes called brittle bone disease. In this palace, you watch a young archduchess fall from a chaise lounge and break her femur. It's not the first time. It won't be the last. Historians still debate whether some of these broken-boned girls were hidden intentionally or simply ignored by physicians who didn't know what to do. There are records of princesses who broke limbs from sneezing too hard. You'd think that might change the marriage calculus. It didn't. Inbreeding ensured that rare genetic disorders didn't just pass through these families. They pooled. You see, in the general population, recessive mutations usually remain dormant. But in dynasties where cousins kept marrying cousins, the odds of two carriers producing a symptomatic child skyrocketed. It wasn't just bleeding and breaking. Some daughters suffered from epilepsy, deafness, stunted growth, joint hypermobility, or malformed spines. In portraits, they're posed stiffly, often seated, looking demure, but many couldn't stand for long without pain. Artists corrected their postures. History did too. But not all was hidden. Sometimes the symptoms were woven into mythology, like the belief that Queen Victoria was touched by God for enduring so much loss, or that Tsarevich Alexei's agony brought his mother closer to mysticism and to Rasputin. Spoiler alert, bad trade. Rasputin's influence over the Russian court wasn't just political, it was maternal desperation. Alexandra clung to him because he seemed to soothe her son's pain. But the deeper story was one of royal daughters turned mothers, still shackled by genes they couldn't see, forced to watch their children pay the price. You stroll through a hallway of tiny shoes, some embroidered, some unworn. It's a quiet tribute to the daughters who died before age 5, before portraits were painted or names remembered, many from blood disorders. And yet, no one thought to stop the genetic roulette. Love had little to do with these unions. Power did, and tradition. One fringe theory, you're going to like this one, suggests that the obsession with purity among royals wasn't just ideological. Some court advisors genuinely believed that by concentrating royal blood, they were distilling divine traits, like trying to boil wine until it becomes holy water. The results, more like vinegar. You step into a palace infirmary where the physicians resemble medieval alchemists more than doctors. They test blood with feathers, assign personalities based on the balance of humors, and pray over swollen joints. These were the finest minds money could buy, and they still thought bloodletting helped with fainting. As the 20th century dawned, medical science finally caught up. Blood types were discovered, genes were mapped, but for many royal daughters it was too late. They'd already lived their lives as cautionary tales, or worse, as forgotten footnotes. You pause before a stained glass window. Light filters through, casting ruby-colored streaks on the floor. It almost looks like blood. You think of those girls who couldn't run, couldn't dance, couldn't even sneeze without risk. Their beauty didn't protect them. Their titles didn't save them. All the silk and silver couldn't mend what centuries of inbreeding had undone. But they smiled anyway, or were told to. Because that was the job. You're standing at the edge of another royal garden, formal, symmetrical, perfectly pruned. Much like the expectations placed on the royal daughters who once walked these paths. Look pretty, stay quiet, smile softly, don't think too hard. Tonight, you're visiting the daughters whose beauty was praised endlessly, but whose minds, if they dared to shine, were politely ignored or quietly suppressed. Because while kings wanted heirs and queens wanted alliances, what no one seemed to want was a royal daughter with a mind of her own. You stroll alongside a young Archduchess of Austria. Her skin is porcelain pale, her hair curled into mathematically precise ringlets. She has been trained since infancy in posture, embroidery, and the exact shade of modesty to wear in her smile. But she also hides a book inside her psalter, philosophy, written by a man who would be scandalized to know she was reading it. And she reads in secret because knowledge in a royal woman was often considered inconvenient. One mainstream historical fact: the education of royal daughters was almost always limited. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a princess might learn French, Latin prayers, and a few chords on the harpsichord. But politics, science, law, no, thank you. That's for the boys. Even when they governed entire kingdoms as regents or consorts, they were expected to do so with feminine intuition, not logic or strategy. You pass by Marie Antoinette, her towering powdered hair casting a shadow wider than her political knowledge. She was just 14 when sent from Austria to France. Her job wasn't to understand treaties. It was to wear Versailles like a second skin and produce an heir, preferably without asking too many questions. And yet behind closed doors, many of these daughters were asking questions. Some wrote letters in code. Others formed discreet intellectual salons, often framed as tea gatherings to stay out of trouble. Still others took to writing, but under pseudonyms. Historians still argue whether Princess Charlotte of Wales, daughter of the future George IV, was quietly working on an abolitionist essay before her early death. Then there's the myth of the ornamental princess, a concept that hardened in the Victorian era. Soft-spoken, tender-hearted, morally pure, and completely harmless. Think Queen Victoria's daughters, dressed like porcelain shepherdesses, reciting Bible verses and stitching samplers of lambs beside brooks. But you peek under the embroidery, and there's restlessness stitched between the threads. Let's not forget the Habsburgs again. While the family tree was folding in on itself, their daughters were still being painted with halos of innocence and beauty, when in truth, some suffered not just genetic afflictions, but deep psychological strain. What happens when you're told your entire worth lies in how agreeable and delicate you are, and you're secretly smarter than half the men around you? Take Princess Elizabeth of Bavaria, better known as Sissy, who married Emperor Franz Joseph I, a beauty icon in her time, famous for her waist-length hair and 19-inch corseted figure. But few mention her depression, her obsession with fitness bordering on starvation, and her journals filled with melancholic poetry. People admired her for being the image of femininity, but behind the mirrors she was unraveling. Fringe tidbit, royal beauty routines were innovative, to say the least. Sissy slept with raw veal on her face to preserve her skin. Others bathed in milk or powdered themselves with crushed pearls. One French duchess rubbed pigeon blood on her cheeks for a natural flush. And yet, nobody thought to offer these women an actual education beyond how to glow. You lean against a marble column and watch a girl struggle to learn chess in secret, because her father believes it's too strategic for a lady. You see another furiously composing music, only to have her compositions handed off to a court musician to finish properly. Their ideas were only allowed to live when they wore other people's names. Of course, there were exceptions. Catherine the Great of Russia, originally a German princess, clawed her way to power through intelligence and sheer audacity. But remember, she had to depose her own husband to rule. Her story is a glorious outlier, not the norm. Most daughters were expected to be quiet decorations in elaborate political theater. By the 19th century, as revolution simmered and education spread beyond the elite, some royal daughters did push harder. Queen Victoria's daughter Louise became a sculptor and patron of the arts, even shocking the court by marrying a non-royal. But she was ridiculed for being bohemian, code for, why isn't she behaving like a proper princess? You overhear whispers from a drawing room. She's clever, but don't worry, it's not in a threatening way. That was the fine line royal daughters had to walk. Be amusing, not opinionated. Be curious, but never confrontational. Be smart, but only when it flatters your suitor. Even today, echoes of this expectation linger. Think of how modern royal women are praised for poise, elegance, wardrobe choices, but rarely for policy stances, speeches, or intellect. It's the same old corset, just made of softer fabric. Historians still argue whether this was intentional or incidental. Was the suppression of royal female intelligence a systematic design, or just a side effect of male-centric dynasties? Either way, the result was generations of women praised for their beauty and punished for their brains. You watch as the candlelight dims in another royal study, its ink bottles untouched, its globe unspun. You imagine the minds that once sat here, brimming with ideas with nowhere to place them. No platform, no permission. And yet somehow they left traces. Marginalia in books, unpublished manuscripts, letters burned but partially transcribed by nosy archivists, the quiet legacy of intelligence smothered by tradition. You close the door gently behind you, as if not to disturb the echo of thoughts still bouncing inside. The hallway you're walking down tonight is narrow, dimly lit, and far from the golden grandeur of the throne rooms and ballrooms you've wandered through before. This one smells of mildew and faded lavender sachets, used to mask something less elegant. Here, in the hushed shadows of Europe's palaces and country estates, lived the daughters you were never meant to see. These are the hidden ones, the princesses quietly removed from public life due to deformities, disabilities, or mental illness. You won't find their names in most family trees, at least not proudly. They were airbrushed out of portraits, given distant titles, or falsely reported as having died in infancy. You're entering the wing of the palace where the curtain stayed drawn and the whispers never made it past the staircase. One mainstream historical fact: royal families, especially during the height of dynastic inbreeding, had a startling rate of what was euphemistically called delicate health. And when that delicacy manifested in visible or cognitive impairments, the solution was almost always concealment. In an era obsessed with perfection as proof of divine favor, a visibly disabled daughter didn't fit the PR campaign of the crown. You pass by the story of Princess Alexandrina of Bavaria, who reportedly believed she had swallowed a glass piano as a child. While modern psychiatry would file that under complex delusion, at the time, it was simply too embarrassing to explain. Her family kept her largely out of sight and described her condition as a peculiarity. How convenient. More chillingly, there's the case of the Bourbon princesses of Spain and Naples, whose facial deformities and severe developmental disorders were so pronounced that some were baptized and buried in secret, never formally introduced at court. One was said to be kept at the convent, which in royal speak was often a euphemism for permanent seclusion. Historians still argue whether these seclusions were motivated more by shame, superstition, or misguided protection. In some cases, it seems the families genuinely believed they were sparing the girls public cruelty. In others, it was about optics. Bloodlines needed to appear strong, even as they were crumbling at the genetic seams. You step into a quiet nursery with dust-covered toys, where one princess was kept well into adulthood. She was rumored to speak in rhymes, avoid eye contact, and only interact with her nursemaid. Her name never appeared in dispatches. Her portrait was painted once, then locked away in the attic. Fringe tidbit: in 18th century France, one hidden royal daughter was recorded as being spiritually afflicted and was subjected to leech therapy, mercury rinses, and ice baths, all standard treatments for cleansing the humors. No wonder she stopped speaking. You would too. And then there were the country retreats, grand homes far from the capital, where troubled daughters were sent for rest. But you get there and realize it's just a well-decorated prison. Servants are under orders to say nothing, visitors are rare, and the girl inside might live 40 years without ever being acknowledged in the official record. One tragic example: Princess Johanna of Austria, who reportedly lived her entire life confined due to an undisclosed condition of spirit and form. No letters from her survive, no direct portraits, just vague mentions in estate inventories. The lady's chamber requires more candle wax than expected. That's it, her life measured in wax. You peek into an old wardrobe and find the dresses, perfectly tailored and never worn. Labels embroidered with initials that never made it onto marriage contracts. These girls were still given all the trappings of nobility: gilded hairbrushes, jeweled slippers, hand-stitched prayer books, but never the dignity of presence. And while the hidden daughters were out of sight, they were not always forgotten. You find marginal notes in Queen's diaries. "Visited M today, she hummed to herself in the garden." Or, "May God give her peace, the birds seem to comfort her." Glimpses of love within the silence, but always behind closed doors. Sometimes the cover-up was so successful that later historians stumbled upon these lives only by accident. Misfiled letters, medical bills, or servant testimonies during estate disputes. And then suddenly, the illusion cracks. A whole life previously erased flickers back into view for a moment. But not all secrets stayed secrets. In 19th century Russia, Grand Duchess Anna Petrovna was briefly presented at court before her epilepsy became too unpredictable for public appearances. She was then quietly relocated and died in obscurity, official cause listed as weakness. But you read between the lines. Weakness was often code for, "We don't want to explain." You sit for a moment in one of these forgotten bedrooms, your fingers tracing the pattern of a tapestry stitched by a princess who never traveled more than 10 miles from her estate. Her world was one of birdsong, scheduled walks, and endless supervision. And while she may not have understood the full scope of her isolation, somewhere deep inside, she must have felt it. Royal daughters like her were rarely mourned in newspapers. Their deaths were often attributed to vague causes, a lingering illness, melancholia, delicacy of constitution. Some weren't even given funerals befitting their rank, just a quiet burial at dawn and a wreath sent to the family chapel. And yet, some left legacies in unexpected ways. One hidden daughter was said to compose lullabies passed down through servants, melodies that later entered folk traditions. Another created a herbal remedy that became popular in her local village, unknowingly healing the very people who never knew her name. You realize that these daughters, though hidden, were not invisible. Their presence haunted the palaces, lingered in the margins, and resisted total erasure. Even now, archivists and historians continue to rediscover their threads, braiding them slowly back into the royal tapestry from which they were so carefully snipped. As you leave the corridor, you look back one more time. The doors are still closed, but you've seen what's behind them. You know now that for every princess paraded through Versailles or Vienna, there were others tucked quietly into side chambers, their lives uncelebrated, their stories half told. But not forgotten. The music is soft, almost liturgical as you drift into Spain's royal halls. Golden light filters through heavy tapestries, casting gentle halos on the marble floors. Everything looks sacred, like a church masquerading as a palace. And into this reverent quiet step the infantas, the royal daughters of Spain, dressed in silk stiff as armor, their eyes solemn beyond their years. You're here for the flower girls, darling to the artist but not to fate. You recognize their faces before their names. That's because court painters, most famously Diego Velázquez, immortalized them in masterpieces that still hang in the Prado Museum. Rosy cheeks, impossibly wide skirts, delicate hands holding fans or miniaturized pets. They seem ethereal, don't they? Almost too perfect. But then you blink and you realize they were too perfect. Many of Spain's royal daughters, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, were trapped inside their own portraits, symbols of dynastic strength rather than individuals with futures. And those iconic paintings, often done when the girls were still toddlers, long before their fates had time to unfold. Because by the time they reached adolescence, too many had died, or worse, deteriorated. The mainstream fact here is stark. Infant mortality among Spanish royals, especially girls, was alarmingly high. In part due to medical ignorance, yes, but also because of deep, continuous inbreeding within the Habsburg and Bourbon lines. The Spanish court was practically obsessed with preserving limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. That purity, it became poison. You visit the nursery of Infanta Margarita Teresa, the little girl immortalized in Las Meninas, that famous Velázquez painting. She looks radiant, surrounded by attendants, yet history shows her life was riddled with suffering. She was married off to her maternal uncle, a classic Habsburg move, and endured 4 pregnancies by the time she turned 20. None of her children lived long, neither did she. By modern standards, she likely suffered from congenital issues linked to her parents' close kinship. She was short-statured, prone to illness, and according to court records, frequently bedridden. But at the time, none of this was seen as surprising, just tragic, and tragically ordinary. The Spanish court kept a meticulous record of royal births and deaths, but it's the silences that speak louder. One infanta, Maria Ana Antonia, is described in a single sterile line. Born of the king's second wife, died within the year. No cause, no comment, not even a sigh. Historians still argue whether the short, brutal lives of these girls were due primarily to genetic disorders or to the extreme confinement and over-control of their environments. After all, they weren't allowed to run, sweat, or even eat freely. Every move was scripted. Their clothing, heavy and stiff, designed for stillness, not play. Their hairdos required hours of combing. Their sleep schedules were ruled by superstition. One fringe tidbit: some infantas were raised with their hands gently tied at night to encourage gracefulness. Posture was everything, survival less so. You wander through El Escorial, the vast and echoing royal monastery palace, and feel the full weight of this dynastic gloom. It's not a joyful place, more mausoleum than home. Buried within its walls are dozens of royal children, many of them daughters, stacked in marble crypts marked with little more than initials. The royal motto was plus ultra, further beyond, but these girls never got that far. And remember that beautiful obsession with bloodlines. Well, by the 1700s, Spain's royals had looped their genetics into such a tight knot that Charles II, Margarita Teresa's nephew, was born with a jaw too misshapen to chew, legs too weak to walk unaided, and a cognitive condition so severe his court debated whether he was aware of his own reign. He had no children, which meant the flower girls of the Habsburg legacy, those little infantas in their gilt-edged dresses, were truly the last buds of a dying tree. You pause to look at one painting of a young infanta holding a doll. The resemblance is uncanny. You realize the doll is modeled after her, a gift from the painter, a tiny version of herself to carry, as if she wasn't already being turned into a symbol of herself. Art imitating life, imitating suffering. But not all flower girls faded quietly. A few survived just long enough to be exported to other courts, gilded packages wrapped in dowries. One infanta was sent to marry the French dauphin, but died of smallpox en route. Another lived in Portugal for just 6 months before collapsing from what the records call dropsy, a term that covered everything from heart failure to chronic infection. Yet their portraits remain behind, growing more famous than their stories. You begin to suspect that these paintings served not only as status symbols, but as memorials in advance, visual insurance that, even if the girl died, her beauty and dynastic importance would live on in oil and canvas. And here's something you won't find in the art textbooks. Some of these portraits were modified after death. A sickly child made to look rosy, a limp hand corrected. One painting of Infanta Maria Antonia was reworked to remove a telltale facial droop, likely caused by a stroke. Even in death, the illusion of perfection had to be maintained. You close your eyes and imagine what it must have been like for these girls, to be adored but untouched, honored but isolated, painted but barely known. They were called angelitas, little angels, but never given space to be girls. Their childhoods were ceremonial, their illnesses whispered about, their endings abrupt. As you leave the gallery of their images behind, you can't help but feel haunted by how beauty was weaponized, not for their benefit, but to reassure a nation that its future was in elegant, unblemished hands. Hands that, more often than not, trembled from birth. So yes, you've seen the flower girls, and while they may be preserved in portraiture, what inbreeding did to them, shortened their lives, stole their voices, warped their innocence, is not as easily varnished over. The brushstrokes remain, but so do the shadows. You stand in a cold chamber now, not a palace hall or nursery, but the tiled, lamplit quarters of a 17th century court physician. Lined with apothecary jars and astrological charts, the room smells of burnt sage, powdered bone and good intentions gone terribly wrong. This is where science, such as it was, helped shape the destinies of Europe's royal daughters. And tonight, you're getting a front row seat to the weird, warped logic that kept inbreeding alive. You hear murmurs. The blood must remain pure, not just noble, pure, not diluted by foreign peasants or, heaven forbid, outsiders without the right surnames. This obsession with sangre limpia, clean blood, wasn't just a Spanish fixation. It was shared by courts in Austria, France, Portugal, and Russia. Everyone wanted to keep their lines unbroken. Unfortunately, unbroken lines tend to loop, and loops, as you now know, can strangle. The mainstream historical fact is this. For centuries, royal courts believed that inbreeding preserved not only political alliances but moral and spiritual superiority. They weren't trying to ruin their daughters. They thought they were protecting them, and by extension, protecting the nation's soul. So enter the physicians, astrologers, and court experts, whose job was to make this dangerous fantasy sound legitimate. You listen as one Spanish doctor advises the king that a cousin marriage will rebalance the melancholic humors. Another French astrologer charts star alignments to recommend a wedding between a teenage princess and her aging uncle. The science is squishy. One popular fringe belief, that marrying a cousin would stabilize the bloodline against outside diseases. You blink hard at that one. Meanwhile, the actual diseases, hemophilia, scoliosis, fragile bones, neurological disorders, were often caused by those very unions. Still, the royal logic continued. Marry within the family to avoid polluting the royal essence. Problem is, when everyone's carrying the same recessive genes, you don't get essence, you get recessive chaos. The Habsburgs were especially notorious for this. You've already met Charles II of Spain, he of the unfortunate jaw, limp limbs, and tragic sterility. What you didn't see was the web that created him. He was descended from just 6 unique individuals over 16 generations. That's not a family tree. It's a circle drawn in increasingly shaky lines. Historians still argue whether the collapse of the Spanish Habsburgs was due more to political missteps or the compounding effects of genetic inbreeding. What's undeniable is that no amount of powdered unicorn horn, yes, real prescription, or stargazing could fix the deepening gene pool crisis. And those daughters, sweet, obedient, silken daughters, often paid the heaviest price. Their bodies became experiments in genetic roulette, born to prove a theory that was deeply flawed. You watch as one young archduchess is fed a steady diet of figs, mercury drops, and rosewater to protect her womb. She dies at 14. Another is bathed daily in sheep's milk infused with saffron and crushed pearls to ensure fertility. She develops a severe rash, but the court doesn't stop. They just switch pearls for amber and try again. There was even a trend, at one point, of using animal blood in treatment, based on the belief that the vigor of beasts could be passed to delicate princesses. A court physician in 1690 recommended goat's blood transfusions for an anemic infanta. The goat was healthier. But it wasn't all madcap potions and medieval nonsense. Some of the early scientific thinkers of the Enlightenment began raising red flags. You overhear whispers, risky, brave whispers, warning that too much familial overlap might be the reason for so many miscarriages, so many mentally impaired royal children. But these voices were usually ignored, or exiled, or quietly silenced under the velvet drapes of tradition. And the public, they were fed the myth. Portraits showed perfect daughters. Decrees described glowing marriages and blossoming heirs. Behind closed doors, girls struggled to breathe, to walk, to conceive. But none of that was official. One quirky tidbit: court midwives were often banned from keeping written records, lest someone compare outcomes across generations. Instead, they were expected to memorize births, deaths, and defects, then relay them orally to the royal chronicler, who also left out anything unsavory. Even architecture played its part in the silence. In many palaces, sickly daughters were moved to separate wings or distant countryside homes. Out of sight, out of mind, but still technically alive. These homes became gentle prisons, gilded sanatoriums for girls born too warped for court life. You walk through one such estate now, its walls lined with portraits of forgotten princesses. Their painted eyes follow you with eerie resignation. These were the daughters who couldn't be married off, who didn't pass the marriageable minimum. The system that exalted blood purity had no use for the girls it damaged. And yet the rituals continued. Every new birth was still celebrated with pomp, every baby girl's horoscope cast within hours, priests blessed the bassinets, court doctors weighed the umbilical cord, and every time the whispers returned, will this one survive? Will she be strong? Will she bear heirs? No one ever asked, will she be happy? By the late 1700s, Enlightenment thinkers had begun to erode the worst of these practices. Science was evolving. Bloodlines were still important, but slowly, methodically, Europe's monarchies began marrying outside their own family circles. Some even ventured gasp into non-royal unions. The gene pool, gasping and shallow, began to refill. But it came too late for many royal daughters. They remained symbols of a theory gone awry, beautiful proof that obsession, whether with purity, power, or misguided science, has consequences, sometimes measured in blood. You glance one last time at the alchemical diagrams and dusty bottles of that physician's room. They meant well, but meaning well didn't save those girls. Only change did, and it came crawling, not running. You're slipping into quieter rooms now. The curtains hang a little lower, and the air smells less of incense and more of ink, fresh pages, personal letters, secret journals. Here walk the royal daughters who didn't quietly submit, the ones who resisted the centuries-long machinery of inbreeding, alliance-making, and powdered compliance. And they did it not in revolutions or riots, but in silk slippers and hushed defiance. You meet them one by one, often in candlelit corners of history. They rarely get full chapters in textbooks, but tonight you're listening closely. There's Christina of Sweden, for instance, sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, and utterly disinterested in marriage. A queen in her own right, she scandalized Europe by refusing to marry any of the perfectly selected, well-bred cousins paraded before her. Instead, she studied philosophy, wore men's clothes, and even abdicated her throne to avoid becoming a royal broodmare. You kind of want to fist bump her. Then there's Catherine the Great, not born royal but married into a bloodline so cramped it practically squeaked. Instead of succumbing to its limits, she outmaneuvered them, survived a coup, and rewrote the rules of power. She brought enlightenment to Russia, corresponded with Voltaire, and yes, had a personal life scandalous enough to make the royal family trees curl. Not all resistance looked like rebellion. Some of it looked like compromise. Princess Maria Theresa of Austria, deep in the thick of Habsburg inbreeding, managed to have 16 children and rule an empire. But what set her apart? She started to notice the pattern. Of her surviving daughters, she married some outside the traditional circles. One even wed into a then-fledgling French dynasty, injecting new blood into an old crown. You might know her better as Marie Antoinette. Now sure, Marie's story doesn't end well, cake and guillotines and all. But genetically speaking, she was a welcome pause in the echo chamber of cousin marriage. Ironically, historians still argue whether her downfall was political tone deafness or the accumulated backlash against centuries of royal insulation. Probably both. Another quiet rebel, Princess Charlotte of Wales. The daughter of George IV, she was one of the few English royals with a shot at both popularity and physical robustness. But she resisted the suitor her father wanted, an inbred European cousin, and chose Leopold of Saxe-Coburg instead. He was still noble, yes, but healthier stock. Their marriage was genuinely affectionate, even modern for its time. Tragically, she died in childbirth, but her brief rebellion mattered. It hinted at a different royal future, one where daughters weren't just passed around like treaty tokens. Not every princess had the political luxury to resist. Many had to find subtler routes: writing, patronage, art. You peek over the shoulder of Princess Elizabeth of the Palatinate, who turned down several advantageous matches to study Descartes and correspond about metaphysics. She spent her life unmarried, unbent, and brilliantly unreadable to the men around her. And then there's Princess Wilhelmine of Prussia, whose brother Frederick the Great wanted to marry her off to any cousin who would strengthen his military alliances. She resisted each match until she could choose a husband she at least vaguely liked. That was victory enough. These weren't revolutions, but they were pivots, sometimes small, sometimes symbolic, but all brave. One quirky tidbit: some royal daughters even faked illnesses to delay or dodge arranged marriages. The classic fainting spells and weak lungs weren't always medical, they were tactical. Play sick long enough and the suitor might move on. It was risky, but for some, it worked. Of course, not all acts of rebellion ended in freedom. Some daughters were punished for their resistance, locked away, isolated, or rebranded as mentally unstable. The line between free thinking and madness was perilously thin when you were royal and female. Historians still debate whether Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sissy, as she was known, was a rebel or simply too wild for the cage she was born into. Her diaries suggest both. What's certain is that she saw the rot. She despised the court's rules, loathed its emphasis on bloodlines, and referred to royal life as a burden inherited like a disease. She wandered Europe by train, shunning court duties, writing poems about death, and eating barely enough to stay upright. A protest in whispers. Some daughters took resistance a step further. Queen Victoria's own children were a genetic crossroads. Victoria carried the hemophilia gene, unknowingly spreading it into the royal houses of Spain, Russia, and Germany. But two of her daughters, Alice and Louise, chose to marry outside the Central European dynastic loop. One founded hospitals, the other championed education. Neither would be remembered just as wounds. The final decades of the 19th century saw the inbreeding system begin to unravel. Medical science had caught up. Public opinion started to shift. Monarchies leaned more toward diplomatic unions than genetic purity. And royal daughters, they began to marry for compatibility, sometimes even love. You watch as engagement portraits grow less formal, wedding announcements less mechanical. Daughters start choosing, at least a little. It's not liberation, not yet, but it's a sliver of sky through the palace bars. By the early 20th century, the royal world that had shaped and misshaped so many girls was crumbling. World wars would sweep across Europe, toppling thrones and upending the very idea of nobility. Suddenly, all those centuries of fragile porcelain daughters seemed like the ghost of a fading dream. Still, their stories remain, not just of suffering but of sly courage, of whispered no's and carefully chosen husbands, of knowledge passed between sisters, of marriages delayed, diaries burned, and names changed. They weren't always loud, but they were deliberate. And tonight, as you leave behind those quiet drawing rooms and secret corridors, you realize something. Resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it wears a silk gown and smiles politely while refusing to marry her cousin. The palace halls are empty now. The laughter, the scheming, the formal dances beneath chandeliers, gone. You walk slowly through what remains, portraits hanging crooked, family trees brittle with dust, and the faint scent of old perfume lingering like memory. This is the legacy left by royal daughters whose bloodlines had looped and knotted too many times. And you can't help but see the whole tapestry now. Not just a few tragic girls, but the system that wove them. Each thread in that tapestry is delicate, spun from politics, desperation, superstition, and stubborn tradition. And most of those threads fray in the same places. Childhood illnesses, miscarriages, early deaths, missing teeth, slurred speech, mental fragility. The Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Romanovs, the Wittelsbachs. You watch their daughters carry 1,000 years of dynastic pressure on shoulders increasingly too narrow to bear it. Some lines ended with a sigh. Others ended in fire. The Romanovs fell in a basement in Yekaterinburg with bullets and confusion and final prayers. Anastasia, remember her. was the princess people wanted to survive, even invented survival myths for. But those myths weren't about her. They were about grief and guilt, and how no one wanted to believe royalty could vanish so pitifully. Other legacies live on in medical journals. The Habsburg jaw, the Bourbon nose, the recurring hemophilia that stalked the sons but was carried by the daughters. You saw how Queen Victoria's seemingly healthy girls became genetic time bombs, married into half the continent, taking the clotting defect with them. It didn't matter how gentle their manners were or how well they played the harp. Inside, their DNA whispered doom. You're beginning to see how it wasn't just biology, it was philosophy. The very idea of purity, that marrying your cousin made the blood stronger, that royal bloodlines were divinely chosen and thus must never mingle with the ordinary. You heard that same idea repeat itself across centuries, from castle libraries to cathedral pulpits to palace doctors with their leeches and charts. And yet the irony, the more they clung to purity, the weaker they became. By the time the 20th century rolled around, royal houses were top-heavy with names and titles, and hollowed out by disease, mental decline, and dwindling relevance. The very system meant to preserve power had rotted it from within. But you also saw change, didn't you? You watched a few royal daughters say no. Not many, but enough to shift the current just a bit. Enough to leave legacies not of bloodlines but of choices. Enough to hint that even in a palace, a girl could be more than a bargaining chip in a corset. Take Princess Louise of the United Kingdom, Queen Victoria's daughter, the one who married a commoner. Gasp. Scandal. But her marriage lasted, and she kept sculpting, writing, and shaking off the stiff mold her mother insisted upon. Her resistance didn't bring down monarchies, but it cracked the idea that daughters should just comply. Historians still argue whether these cracks meant anything long-term. Was it just a flicker before the final collapse? Or did those rebellious girls plant seeds that helped modernize monarchies, even democratize them slightly? You decide. What's certain is this: when the crowns eventually slipped and the empires fell, it was the royal daughters, frail and gilded and forgotten, who symbolized what had gone wrong. Not because they were weak, but because they were sacrificed for the idea of unbreakable lineage. Their bodies bore the cost. Their stories carried the echo. And even now, in the 21st century, when royals still wave from balconies, you can feel the past tugging at their gowns. Their DNA might be scrubbed a little cleaner, their marriages a little freer, but the ghosts of those porcelain daughters are still here, smiling faintly from oil portraits, watching quietly from forgotten wings of old castles. You've seen them, haven't you? The ones with tragic eyes and impossibly long names. The ones married off too young or never married at all. The ones who died in childbirth or were locked away when their minds cracked under the weight. The ones who faked illnesses to escape their fate. The ones who taught themselves astronomy. The ones who ran. The ones who stayed. Their legacies aren't always carved in marble. Sometimes they're just faint outlines, pressed into old diary pages, hinted at in family letters. But you found them. You followed them through 15 chapters of silk and suffering and stubbornness. And now it's time to leave. You step out of the palace. The sky is dark, but it's not heavy. The air feels clearer. Maybe it's the absence of incense. Maybe it's the weight lifted from 1,000 whispered stories now heard. You don't need a final lesson, just the memory of how power, unchecked and unchallenged, can collapse inward, and how sometimes survival is resistance, even if it's quiet. So now, as the echoes fade and the candlelight softens, you can feel yourself sinking gently back into the quiet hush of your own room. The grand corridors are behind you. The heavy crowns, the crumbling dynasties, the whispering tapestries, all tucked away like old bedtime toys, set back on the shelf. You've walked with ghosts tonight, and they've shown you more than just broken bones or gilded prisons. They've shown you the cost of a 1,000-year idea unraveling, thread by thread. Let your breath slow. Let your eyes drift. There's no need to remember every name or every twisted family branch. What matters is the shape of the journey, the weight of history softened into story, the simple truth that even the grandest families couldn't outrun the limits of blood and biology. And somewhere in that sprawling, candlelit past, you found moments of tenderness, of quiet defiance, of unlikely resilience. Maybe that's what stays with you most, the flickers of spirit in the daughters born to dynasties doomed by their own design. You don't have to solve the mystery or fix the history. All you have to do is rest now, knowing you've walked carefully through it, with empathy and curiosity. The palace is silent now. The portraits are still. The stars outside your window are no longer watching over kingdoms. They're just glowing softly for you. So close your eyes. Exhale once more. Let the world of royal daughters and broken bloodlines slip away like mist behind a carriage window. They're resting now. And so can you. Sweet dreams.